The camera flickered to life, capturing a dimly lit lecture hall at Caltech, where decades ago a young Elon Musk sat among eager students, scribbling notes and dreaming of worlds beyond. Now, in 2025, he stood on that same stage, not as a student, but as a titan of industry, invited to speak about innovation and the human spirit. The audience buzzed with anticipation, a mix of tech enthusiasts, students, and a few graying academics who remembered the lanky kid with wild ideas. Among them was Professor Harold Grayson, a wiry, bespectacled man with a reputation for tearing down anything he deemed illogical, especially faith. Grayson had taught Elon in his undergrad days, and their history was a tangled knot of admiration and friction. Back then, Elon's quiet mentions of spirituality, a belief in something greater guiding his relentless drive, had irked Grayson, who saw it as a flaw in an otherwise brilliant mind. Why would a man of science cling to such nonsense? Could intellect and faith truly coexist, or was Elon deluding himself? What happens when a mentor's disdain festers into a personal crusade? That night Grayson sat in the front row, arms crossed, his thin lips curled into a smirk. Elon's speech began with his usual flair, weaving tales of Mars colonization and neural networks. But then he veered into uncharted territory. He spoke of purpose, of a force beyond equations that fueled his ambition, a belief that had steadied him through failures and sleepless nights. The crowd leaned in, captivated, but Grayson's smirk vanished. He shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching as if itching to interrupt. This wasn't the Elon he'd trained, the one he'd molded to reject superstition. To him, this was betrayal, a stain on the legacy of reason he'd tried to instill. Was Elon's faith a crutch, or had it forged him into the man who'd defied gravity itself? The tension simmered, a storm brewing beneath the surface as Grayson decided he couldn't let this slide. He'd waited years for a chance to confront his former protege, and now, with the world watching, he'd expose what he saw as Elon's greatest weakness. As Elon paused to take a sip of water, Grayson shot to his feet, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He didn't wait for an invitation, launching into a tirade about the absurdity of religion, his words dripping with condescension. The audience gasped, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning forward, sensing a showdown. Elon's hand froze mid-air, the bottle hovering, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face the man who'd once graded his papers. Grayson mocked the idea of a guiding force, calling it a fairy tale for the weak-minded, a delusion unfit for a man of Elon's caliber. The room held its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Elon set the bottle down slowly, deliberately, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just a debate, it was personal, a collision of past and present, mentor and student, reason and belief. What would Elon do? Would he shrink, or would he fight? The lecture hall felt smaller now, the walls closing in as Elon stood motionless, his gaze locked on Professor Grayson. The older man's voice still echoed, sharp and biting, his accusation hanging heavy in the air. He'd called Elon's faith a childish fantasy, a blemish on his genius, and the crowd waited, eyes darting between the two men. Elon's silence stretched, not out of hesitation but calculation, his mind racing behind those piercing eyes. Grayson, emboldened by the lack of response, pressed harder, pacing the aisle like a prosecutor in a courtroom. He recounted their university days, how he'd drilled into Elon the primacy of logic, the purity of science, only to see him now spouting what Grayson deemed mystical drivel. His tone grew harsher, more personal, jabbing at Elon's character, questioning how a man who'd conquered engineering marvels could fall prey to such irrationality. Elon's fingers curled slightly at his sides, the only hint of the storm brewing within. He'd faced skeptics before, critics of his companies, his visions, but this was different. Grayson wasn't just attacking an idea, he was attacking a piece of Elon's soul, a cornerstone that had carried him through the darkest nights, when SpaceX faltered and Tesla teetered on collapse. The professor's words weren't merely an intellectual challenge, they were a dismissal of the man Elon had become, a man who'd woven faith into his relentless pursuit of the impossible. The audience sensed the shift, a ripple of unease spreading, as Elon's stillness morphed into something deliberate, almost predatory. Grayson, oblivious, kept going, his voice rising, his face flushed with the thrill of tearing down what he saw as a flaw. Then Elon moved. He stepped forward not with aggression but with a quiet intensity that silenced the room. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, cutting through Grayson's bluster like a laser. He didn't shout, didn't need to. He began by acknowledging their past, the late-night debates in Grayson's office, the professor's influence on his early thinking. But then the tone shifted, a subtle edge creeping in. Elon spoke of the chaos of his life, the moments when logic alone wasn't enough, when equations couldn't mend a broken spirit or fuel a dream no one else believed in. He described sleepless weeks, the weight of near ruin, and how his belief in something greater had been a lifeline, a quiet strength Grayson could never understand. The crowd leaned in, some nodding, others wide-eyed, as Elon's words painted a picture of resilience they hadn't expected. Grayson faltered, his rhythm disrupted, but he wasn't done. He sneered, accusing Elon of romanticizing hardship, of using faith as a marketing gimmick for his messianic image. The jab landed, and for a moment, Elon's eyes flashed with something raw, unguarded. The professor smirked, thinking he'd struck a nerve, but he'd miscalculated. That flash wasn't weakness, it was fire, and Elon was just getting started. The air crackled with tension, the audience on edge, sensing the confrontation tipping toward a breaking point. Grayson had thrown down a gauntlet, but Elon was picking it up, and he wasn't about to let it go unanswered. Elon's gaze sharpened, pinning Grayson where he stood, the professor's smirk fading under the weight of that stare. The room hummed with tension, every breath held as Elon took a single step closer to the edge of the stage. His voice, still, controlled, deepened with a gravity that made the air feel heavy. He didn't flinch from Grayson's latest barb, the accusation of exploiting faith for fame. Instead, he turned it back, asking the professor when he'd last risked anything for a belief, when he'd last stepped beyond the safety of his textbooks into the unknown. The question hung there, unanswered, as Grayson's face tightened, his confidence wavering for the first time. Elon pressed on, his words measured but relentless, peeling back the layers of his own life to reveal the scars beneath the success. He spoke of the early days at SpaceX, when rockets exploded and investors walked away, leaving him with nothing but debt and doubt. He described the nights pacing his office, the world calling him a fool, and how his faith, quiet and unshakable, had whispered that failure wasn't the end. It wasn't about dogma or deities, he said, but a conviction that meaning existed beyond the visible, a thread that tied his wildest dreams to something eternal. The audience felt it, the rawness of a man who'd stared into the abyss and kept going, not because of equations but because of something deeper. Grayson shifted, his hands clenching, as Elon's story stripped away the professor's smug superiority, exposing the gulf between their worlds. The older man tried to rally, cutting in with a scoff, claiming Elon's success came from intellect alone, that faith was a bystander at best, a delusion at worst. But his voice lacked its earlier bite, and the crowd sensed it. Elon didn't let him finish. He pivoted, his tone growing sharper, more confrontational, as he challenged Grayson's worldview head-on. He asked how a man so obsessed with proof could dismiss the unmeasurable, the intangible forces that drive human will. He pointed out the professor's career, safe and predictable, built on tearing down rather than creating. The room buzzed, some students exchanging glances, others nodding as Elon's words landed like blows. Grayson's face reddened. His argument, stumbling as he tried to regain footing, but Elon was relentless, his calm unraveling into a controlled fury. The shift was electric. Elon leaned forward, his voice rising just enough to command every corner of the hall, recounting how faith had fueled his defiance of odds, from electric cars to Mars missions, while Grayson sat in lecture halls critiquing from the sidelines. The professor snapped back, his temper flaring, accusing Elon of arrogance, of twisting reality to fit his narrative. But the words sounded hollow, defensive, and the audience could feel the tide turning. Elon's eyes glinted, a spark of triumph flickering as he saw Grayson's facade crack. The confrontation had reached its peak, a clash of wills laid bare, and Elon was poised to deliver the final strike. The lecture hall crackled with energy, the air thick as Elon stood tall, his presence dominating the stage. Grayson's outburst lingered, his accusation of arrogance echoing weakly against the walls, but it was clear he'd lost the room. His face, flushed and contorted, betrayed a man scrambling to reclaim control, while Elon remained steady, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. The audience leaned forward, caught in the gravity of the moment, sensing the shift as Elon prepared to dismantle the professor's crumbling argument. He didn't rush, didn't need to. His next words came slow and deliberate, each one a hammer striking at Grayson's foundation, exposing the fragility beneath his bluster. Elon turned the confrontation inward, forcing Grayson to face himself. He asked when the professor had last built something, risked something, felt the weight of a dream that could collapse at any moment. He painted a picture of a life spent in ivory towers, critiquing others while the world moved forward, a life that mocked faith because it couldn't grasp its power. The crowd stirred, some shifting uncomfortably, others murmuring in agreement as Elon's voice grew stronger, cutting deeper. He spoke of the human spirit, how it defied logic to reach for the stars, how his belief had been the spark in moments when reason alone faltered. Grayson's world, he said, was small, confined to what he could measure, while Elon stretched beyond the horizon. The professor bristled, his hands trembling as he tried to interrupt, his voice rising in a desperate bid to reclaim authority. He accused Elon of dodging the real issue, of cloaking superstition in poetic fluff. But the words fell flat, drowned by the momentum Elon had seized. The audience wasn't with him anymore, their attention riveted to the man on stage who'd turned vulnerability into strength. Elon didn't let up, his tone sharpening as he zeroed in on Grayson's core flaw, the arrogance of thinking he could dictate what others should feel, what they should believe. He recounted a memory from their university days, a time Grayson had dismissed a student's passion as impractical, a moment that had stuck with Elon as a warning of what he never wanted to become. Grayson's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition, crossing his face, but he had no response. The room felt the weight of that silence, the professor's bravado unraveling as Elon stood unyielding. He didn't yell, didn't gloat, but his words carried a force that left no room for doubt. He finished with a quiet declaration, saying his faith wasn't a weakness to be cured, but a fire that had forged him, a truth Grayson could never erase. The hall erupted in murmurs, some clapping, as Grayson sank back into his seat, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining out of him. Elon had turned the tables, and the professor knew it. The murmurs in the lecture hall swelled, a wave of sound crashing against the silence that had settled over Professor Grayson. He sat, deflated, his hands limp in his lap, the fire that had fueled his earlier tirade snuffed out by Elon's unrelenting resolve. The stage lights cast long shadows, amplifying Elon's figure as he stood unwavering, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The audience felt the shift, an unspoken acknowledgement that the battle had tilted decisively. Elon's last words, a quiet testament to the fire of his faith, lingered in the air, their weight sinking into every corner of the room. Grayson's defeat wasn't just in his silence. It was in the way his eyes darted, avoiding the crowd, avoiding Elon, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Elon didn't let the moment stagnate. He stepped back, his posture loosening slightly, but his gaze never left Grayson. He began to pace the stage, slow and deliberate, his voice dropping into a reflective tone that pulled the audience deeper. He spoke of the countless times he'd been told his dreams were impossible, from colonizing Mars to rewiring the human brain, and how each dismissal had only sharpened his resolve. He tied it back to his belief, not as a blind leap, but as a lens that clarified his purpose, a compass when the path grew dark. The crowd hung on every word, some nodding, others wiping at their eyes, caught in the raw honesty of a man who'd bared his soul to defend what mattered. Grayson twitched, a flicker of defiance stirring as he tried to muster a comeback. He rose, halfway from his seat, his voice raspy, accusing Elon of sidestepping science for sentimentality. But the attempt was feeble, a shadow of his earlier bravado. Elon stopped pacing, turning sharply to face him, and the professor froze. The response came swift and surgical, Elon dismantling the accusation with a question. How could a man who'd never dared to dream beyond his own limits judge the tools that built empires? He pointed to the stars, to the rockets that had pierced the sky, and asked if Grayson truly believed cold logic alone could have carried him there. The professor's mouth opened, then closed, his argument collapsing under its own weight. The room erupted, applause breaking out in pockets, then spreading, a tide of sound that drowned Grayson's fading presence. Elon didn't bask in it, his focus still locked on the professor, but there was a glint in his eye, a spark of satisfaction. He'd exposed Grayson's smallness, not with cruelty but with truth, and the audience felt it, their cheers a visceral release of the tension that had gripped them. Grayson sank fully into his chair, his face a mask of frustration and shame, the confrontation stripping him bare. Elon had won, not just the debate, but the hearts of those watching. His triumph, undeniable. The applause thundered through the lecture hall, a rolling wave that shook the rafters and left no doubt about whose side the crowd had taken. Elon stood at the center of the stage, his face composed, but the faintest curve of his lips betrayed a flicker of pride. The sound washed over Professor Grayson, who remained slumped in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests as if anchoring himself against the tide. The spotlight had shifted, mercilessly illuminating his retreat, his once sharp features now softened by defeat. The audience's energy pulsed, a living thing fueled by the raw emotion of the clash they'd witnessed, and Elon let it breathe, giving the moment space to settle before he spoke again. He turned away from Grayson, addressing the crowd directly, his voice steady but infused with a new warmth. He thanked them not for the applause, but for listening, for grappling with the messy intersection of science and soul alongside him. He wove a final thread into his story, recounting a night years ago when he'd stood alone on a launch pad, watching a Falcon rocket roar into the sky after countless failures. He described the silence that followed, the overwhelming sense of connection to something vast, a moment when faith and physics fused into triumph. It wasn't about proving Grayson wrong, he said, but about honoring what had carried him through. The room hushed, captivated by the vulnerability, the glimpse into a man who'd turned belief into action. Grayson shifted, his head lifting slightly, a last spark of resistance flickering as he tried to interrupt, his voice hoarse and unsteady. He muttered something about empirical evidence, a feeble jab at reclaiming ground, but it was swallowed by the crowd's murmurs, dismissed before it could take root. Elon didn't even glance at him, his focus on the audience, his words rising to a crescendo. He challenged them to question what drove them, to find their own fire, whether in equations or something beyond, and to never let anyone diminish it. The hall vibrated with agreement, hands clapping, feet stomping, a visceral roar that drowned out Grayson's fading presence entirely. The professor's shoulders sagged further, his eyes dropping to the floor, the weight of his irrelevance pressing down. Elon paused, letting the noise fill the space, then offered a final nod to the crowd, a gesture of gratitude and closure. He'd bared his soul, faced down his old mentor, and emerged not just victorious, but transformed in their eyes. Grayson was a footnote now, a man who'd overreached and fallen, while Elon stood taller, his belief unshaken, his legacy reinforced. The confrontation had forged something new, a bond with the audience that pulsed with life. The roar of the crowd reached its peak, a tidal surge of sound that crashed through the lecture hall, shaking the very air. Elon stood at the edge of the stage, his silhouette framed by the spotlight, a figure carved from resilience and quiet, defiance. The applause wasn't just approval, it was a release, an outpouring of emotion from an audience that had ridden the waves of tension, doubt, and triumph alongside him. Professor Grayson remained in his seat, a diminished shadow, his head bowed as if the weight of the moment had pressed him into the ground. His hands, once clenched in challenge, now rested slack, his fight extinguished by the sheer force of Elon's presence and the crowd's unwavering verdict. Elon raised a hand, not to silence the noise, but to acknowledge it, his eyes sweeping the room with a rare softness. He spoke again, his voice cutting through the din with a clarity that demanded attention. He didn't gloat, didn't linger on Grayson's defeat. Instead, he turned the focus outward, thanking the audience for bearing witness, for daring to wrestle with questions that had no easy answers. He recounted one last memory, a quiet night in his childhood, staring at the stars and feeling a pull he couldn't explain, a seed of belief that had grown into the man he was now. It was personal, unguarded, and it struck a chord, the hall falling silent as people leaned in, moved by the simplicity of it. Grayson made no move, no sound, his earlier bravado a distant memory. The crowd barely noticed him, their focus locked on Elon, who stood as a testament to what faith, woven with grit, could achieve. He closed with a call to action, urging them to chase their own impossible dreams, to find strength in whatever fueled them, and to never let anyone strip it away. The words landed like a vow, a spark that ignited the room once more, applause erupting with renewed vigor. Students stood, clapping, their faces alight with inspiration, while others wiped at tears, caught in the swell of emotion that had built to this moment. Elon stepped back, his gaze lingering on the audience, a faint smile breaking through as he absorbed their energy. He'd faced Grayson's scorn, turned it into a weapon, and emerged not just unscathed but elevated, his belief a beacon that had humbled his old professor. Grayson stayed seated as the crowd began to disperse, his figure small and forgotten, a man who'd gambled his pride and lost. Elon walked off the stage, his stride steady, the cheers following him like an echo of victory. The confrontation was over, the triumph complete, a story sealed with no loose ends, only the resounding truth of a man who'd defended his soul and won.